Tonight on Politicat, Super Tuesday has arrived. What's at stake for Democrats and the country?
It's moderates versus progressives, more on the ideological divide within the Democratic Party.
And finally, the political implications of coronavirus, what the president has said and what impact it has.
All that and more tonight on Politicat. It's your politics
right now.
Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Andrew Rowan.
And I'm Justin Sweetwood. Today is Super Tuesday and everything is on the line. Millions of voters from 14 states cast their ballots in what's now a smaller and more compact Democratic field. Super Tuesday will have a major impact on the rest of the 2020 race, and NNN's Megan Leibowitz is in Washington with more. Megan?
Today is a vital day for candidates on the road to the Democratic nomination. 14 states are holding primaries, and more than a third of all delegates to the DNC are up in the air. So what should we be watching for? Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer all dropped out of the race earlier this week. Last night, in a move that considerably consolidates the moderate field, both Buttigieg and Klobuchar endorsed Joe Biden. This is even more good news for Joe Biden, who won South Carolina on Saturday, securing nearly half of all votes. Tonight, we'll see if he can keep up that momentum. Buttigieg and Klobuchar's high-profile endorsements come as Senator Bernie Sanders picked up steam in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Sanders leads the Democrats in most national polls. Also today, Mike Bloomberg makes his debut on the ballot. He spent heavily on advertising in Super Tuesday states, and tonight we'll see if that pays off. I'm Megan Leibowitz reporting from Capitol Hill. Back to you on the desk.
Thanks, Megan. Not only are a third of Democratic delegates up for grabs today, but the field of voters is also incredibly diverse. Over half of the states voting today have significant African American populations. This could be good news for former Vice President Joe Biden, who finished with 50% of the vote in South Carolina, a state with a similar demographic makeup.
And while Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer dropped out earlier this week, votes are still being split. Progressives are largely divided between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, with moderates between Biden and Michael Bloomberg. At the time of recording, polls in the East have just closed, but won't close on the West Coast for another couple of hours. But there's still plenty to talk about, and to discuss more, we'd like to welcome in our panel. We have Dominic Bayer of the NU College Republicans, and Emma Drake, a campaign volunteer for Marie Newman in Illinois' 3rd District. Now, Emma, I'm going to start with you. What's on the line tonight, and what are you expecting to come from Super Tuesday?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting night in terms of the fact that the field has narrowed significantly even since a week ago. And honestly, kind of public opinion and also projections about Joe Biden's performance have changed dramatically. So I think there's kind of a narrative that we've now narrowed this to a Biden versus Bernie Sanders race with progressive versus kind of a traditional moderate incremental change. Two sides of the Democratic Party that have been in tension with one another for a long time. That being said, we still have Elizabeth Warren and Michael Bloomberg in the race, and there's a lot of uncertainty where it goes, but I think after tonight, while we see how Joe Biden performs and whether Bernie Sanders can keep up the momentum that he had very strongly up until everything that's changed in about the past week, I think we'll know more after tonight.
And Dominic, like Emma said, it certainly seems like it's turned into a Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden race, but do you think we're going to have any clarity by the end of the night?
I think it's definitely going to end up swinging one way or the other in terms of who's able to establish the momentum. So I think whoever has the most state wins or the most delegates by the end of the night is going to have the media trumpeting like Super Tuesday was a great night for Joe Biden or a great night for Bernie Sanders. But I think a confounding factor is the performance of Mike Bloomberg and Elizabeth Warren. If either of them is able to notch a couple wins, they might be able to kind of disrupt the one versus one narrative and make it more of a 3 or even 4-person race. So I guess we'll have to wait.
And Dominic, speaking of momentum, this week Joe Biden got endorsements from Buttigieg and Klobuchar. How do we expect that to play out to the results tonight?
I think both of them are going to be really significant, and they might help him a bit. I think one issue that will definitely mitigate the impact of those endorsements is the fact that so many early votes were already in by the time of the endorsement, and there was a very limited amount of time for voters to figure out that these endorsements had happened. I mean, especially low information voters might think these people are still in the race because they just announced yesterday that they were endorsing him. I mean, it's 24 hours to figure out. Unless you're a huge politics junkie, you might just not find out. So that might mitigate the positive impact for Joe Biden.
And Emma, do you think the endorsements are going to play a big factor tonight?
I mean, I think they will certainly play a role, but again, I think it's important to remember, and this is something I remind myself, is that the vast majority of the electorate are not living in a world where what they're doing is consuming a large amount of news media all the time. People are living normal lives full of normal responsibilities and either don't have the time or don't want to invest a huge amount of their time into being really detailed on the nuances of the current political race. That being said, the endorsements will certainly have an impact. If you were all in for Klobuchar or for Buttigieg and you really respect what they said and trust them wholeheartedly, then that endorsement will have a large impact. But of course, just because they endorse Joe Biden does not mean that all of their supporters are going to follow. So I think it remains to be seen what proportion will do so.
And Dominic, this is the first time, you mentioned earlier, this is the first time that Michael Bloomberg is going to appear on the ballot. What impact do you think he's going to have tonight once the results start coming in?
I think it all depends on whether he's able to get a couple wins. If he basically has a barren night, except for American Samoa, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for him to drop out because he's just splitting the moderate vote. But if he's able to win in, say, Oklahoma or Alabama, perhaps, then he can present a case as to why his presence in the race going forward is warranted. But if he doesn't win any states, I think he's going to become a non-issue in the primary.
And I'm glad Dominic just mentioned splitting the moderate vote, because according to an article from Vanity Fair today, a person close to the Bloomberg campaign suggested that Bloomberg drop out before Super Tuesday because he fears that the billionaire will split the moderate vote and almost play the role of Ross Perot or Ralph Nader. Is that how you see it?
I mean, I think it's hard to say. Again, I think there's something to be said for the fact that, if you consume popular media, whether that be TV, radio, even on the internet, what you'll notice is that Bloomberg has absolutely monopolized political advertisements. And so it really depends how people are consuming information. And I think, honestly, it's going to depend on what Americans think about electability, too. If they think it's better to pair, a billionaire with another billionaire, whether it's better to change the narrative with someone like Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden. So I think certainly because Bloomberg and Biden both stand by more moderate policies as opposed to Warren and Sanders' more progressive policies in terms of healthcare, et cetera, I think it certainly takes away from Biden's total electorate, but we just don't know how much.
Do you think Bloomberg's going to be able to take a few states tonight?
I don't think so. But I think especially because there are more than even two candidates in the race, it's certainly possible. And I think regardless of whether he actually takes a state, he's going to have an impact.
And depending, Emma, what those results are tonight, what do you think it'll take for the field to narrow?
I mean, I think it depends. So Bloomberg has this interesting advantage where he has basically, from maybe our standards, kind of an infinite amount of money that he can pour into this. And so the amount of money he has to spend is less elastic than other candidates who rely on campaign contributions and things of that nature. I mean, we still have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who we basically don't even talk about anymore, that have stayed in the race, which is really interesting. And that's a question, too, of when is that momentum going to run out? When is that funding going to run out? And also when those candidates decide that them staying in the race is either not best for themselves or for the country, like we saw with Pete Buttigieg.
Dominic, what does it take for Warren, Gabbard, or Bloomberg to drop out?
I'm pretty confident that Warren will drop out if she's unable to win in Massachusetts, her home state, because quite frankly, it would just be embarrassing for her to continue in the race at that point, just because she couldn't even make a case as to how she can win. I think Gabbard's likely to continue in the race. She doesn't really seem to care about whether she's winning at all or not. I think she's in it more to send a message about the state of the Democratic Party. And Bloomberg, as I said before, if he doesn't win at least one state, there's going to be a lot of pressure for him to exit. But it's a little more unclear, given all his resources. He won't feel the pressure of his purse strings as much as other candidates would.
Alrighty, thank you both. We're going to take a short break right now, but we'll be back with more Super Tuesday coverage after this.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back to Politicat. There's no denying that first-generation voters will have a major impact on this year's race. NNN's Joey Safchik has more.
It's Guadalupe Bravo's first time walking up to a polling place.
I don't know what to expect.
But as Super Tuesday approaches, the 18-year-old Bernie Sanders supporter finds her footing.
But I'm also really excited, yeah.
Lupe isn't only a first-time voter. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, she's a first-generation voter.
It's kind of scary. I don't really know what to expect.
In 2020, millennials and Generation Z combined make up 37% of the electorate. Of the approximate 73 million millennials in the U.S. today, 48 million are first generation.
In order to beat Donald Trump, we're going to need the largest voter turnout in the history of the United States.
Democratic candidates, including frontrunner Sanders, say increasing voter turnout is key to taking back the White House. Rock the Vote, the nonpartisan organization dedicated to pushing young people to the polls, says there are extra barriers to break down when it comes to first-gen voters.
What we're doing right now to kind of eliminate that barrier is making them realize also that voting is a long-term commitment.
Lupe's dad walks her to the polling place a few blocks from their house, standing by as she casts a ballot.
By voting, she's giving the power to someone who we hope will work for everyone the same, without considering their social class. That's what I hope, that everyone who votes sees us all the same.
And for some first-generation Americans, casting a vote at a polling place like this one is only the beginning. Lupe says she's inspired by the 13% of the members of our current Congress who are immigrants or children of immigrants.
It's great.
Lupe says when she votes, she's not only speaking for herself,
but for my family, for my parents who don't have that opportunity.
A Council for Opportunity in Education poll found 97% of first-generation millennials consider higher education a priority. Lupe is on the same page.
Go to college so you could pursue a good career because we didn't have that opportunity.
As Lupe leaves the polling place, proudly wearing her I voted sticker, she has a suggestion to make voting more accessible for immigrants and first-generation voters.
Just making the words a little bit simpler.
In 2020, a political rite of passage for an American generation. In Southgate, Joey Safchik, Medill News Service.
Thanks, Joey. With that, I'd like to welcome back in our panel. So with Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropping out and backing Biden, is the race now more about moderates versus progressives than it is about any one candidate? And is that something that these first generations voters and first-time voters will decide? Emma, I'll start with you.
I think to some degree it is about moderates versus progressives, but I also think that was true before the field narrowed because there kind of are these two parties within the Democratic Party that have opposing views both on what's going to help our country, but then also what's electable. And so I think in that regard, I think first-time voters can have a lot of uncertainty, especially in a time of uncertainty for everyone, about how much do I follow my true beliefs, how much do I focus on who I think is going to be electable in November. And I think that can be a really hard challenge to navigate, especially depending on the resources you have, the people you have to talk to, the time you have to research. So I think that it is going to contribute to that quite a bit. You know, there's been kind of this idea that Warren should drop out of the race in order to push the progressive vote fully to Sanders to get him closer to getting that majority of delegates. And so, I mean, that runs along those lines of, okay, I'm a progressive, but I lean towards Warren. What's the best place for my vote?
And Dominic, how important is voter turnout in this primary and then in the general election in November?
Well, I mean, it depends on who's turning out. I think given the current demographics of the Democratic primary, high turnout will principally benefit Sanders, with the exception of states with a high concentration of minority voters, because African American voters are leaning very heavily towards Joe Biden. So in states with high African American populations, high turnout will benefit Biden more. But in most other states, especially because younger voters and Latino voters are trending really heavily towards Sanders, turnout would really benefit Sanders. So I think it's more dependent on the state, but I think generally would benefit Sanders. And in the general election will be absolutely crucial. I think it's bound to be one of the highest turnout elections in recent history. But I think ultimately a higher turnout will benefit the Democratic candidate more than the Republican. Just looking at the demographics of both parties, given that the Republican Party's more white and older, which are higher turnout demographics than the Democratic Party's base.
And Dominic, I just want to talk a little bit about the consolidation of this field. I know we mentioned it earlier, but were you surprised when Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out just before Super Tuesday, especially Mayor Pete, who, won Iowa? Some thought that he had a lot of momentum going for him.
No, I thought it made perfect sense looking at the polling. I think neither Klobuchar nor Buttigieg had a clear path to victory. They were polling 10, 15% max in most of the Super Tuesday states. And after Joe Biden's blowout victory in South Carolina, he was definitely ascendant. So I think they realized it was better to drop out before having really embarrassing results on Super Tuesday. And then if Biden loses, they can say, oh, Biden wasted this opportunity that we gave him. And if he wins, they can benefit further on by being his running mate or by getting a cushy cabinet position.
And Emma, when Buttigieg endorsed Biden last night, he said almost in a sense that I'm dropping out so we can, rally behind one person to defeat Donald Trump, because that's what's most important for Democrats. Do you think that's the message for Democrats and Democratic voters headed to the polls today, that whatever we can to defeat Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's huge to a lot of people, even people that don't traditionally identify as Democrats but are opposed to having Donald Trump in office are coming over and saying, okay, what is our best option for this? And that goes back to ideas of electability. But when I was knocking on doors for the Newman campaign as well, so many people will say, my first priority, the most important thing is that we get a Democrat into office in November. So that is absolutely huge. And I think that Buttigieg made a really smart decision, both for what he believes the Democratic Party should be putting on stage in November, and also probably for his future political career, because I think he's going to get a lot of praise for his decision.
And Emma, Biden dominated in South Carolina. He won 50% of the vote compared to Bernie's 20%. Did what happened on Saturday save not only Biden's campaign, but potentially the moderates' chance at getting the getting the nomination?
I mean, I think absolutely it changed a lot of people's minds. When we started out this primary, Joe Biden was the clear favorite, and he's had a very disappointing performance. I think people pretty much agree over the past few months. So having that turnaround followed by, these endorsements, having a little bit of a stronger debate performance has certainly helped him and gone from this kind of, oh my gosh, what happened to Joe Biden? He's past his prime, etc., to back positioning him to really a pretty clear path to victory, depending, and I think that's what tonight will give us clarity on, is whether Sanders' momentum is now declining and moving over to Joe Biden's campaign, or we'll see if Sanders continues to have that really strong momentum he's had.
And Dominic, do you agree, was Saturday a big turning point for Joe Biden's campaign?
Oh yeah, no, it was absolutely essential in terms of reviving his campaign, just because the prior narrative was, oh, he's totally screwed. There's no way he can recover from his poor results in Iowa and especially New Hampshire. I think part of it was changing the narrative and also unifying the moderate wing of the party around him. So I think it drastically improved his chances. It might not have saved his campaign completely, just because Sanders is a pretty formidable opponent at this point, but it definitely gave him a substantial boost.
All right, thanks so much, Dominic, and we'll be back with more Politicat after this.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
Welcome back to Politicat. Coronavirus has been doing severe damage to the stock market this past week and has certainly become a hot topic in the political landscape. Zach Miller has more for this week's Money Minute.
Thanks, Justin. 2 weeks ago, the S&P 500 stock index had hit an all-time record high. Then, in the largest one-week drop since the financial crisis in 2008, the same index dropped 11%, wiping out $6 trillion worth of stocks globally. And on Monday, after 7 sessions of straight losses, it regained 4.6%, the largest one-day jump in history. The driving force behind these wild swings is the new coronavirus, which, as of today, has spread to 77 nations worldwide. When we first discussed the coronavirus here on Money Minute 5 weeks ago, the disease had infected less than 6,000 people and was present in only 16 countries. Now, the spread of the novel coronavirus is accelerating around the globe. The World Health Organization has confirmed over 92,000 cases and 3,000 deaths. The virus is now present on every continent except Antarctica. In the U.S., the most significant outbreak so far has been in Washington state, where researchers now believe the disease spread undetected for up to 6 weeks. Health officials say that community transmission in multiple states is likely to continue. Last Tuesday, the CDC's Director of Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, Nancy Messonnier, outlined steps the government would take to isolate citizens in the case of a global pandemic, including shutting down public schools and workplaces. Messonnier warned Americans that disruption to everyday life could be severe. This sent markets into a free fall. Making matters worse, Apple, Microsoft, and a number of other international companies warned investors they would miss revenue targets for the second quarter of 2020. They pointed to China's historic quarantine of 46 million citizens, which wreaked havoc on global supply chains. On Wednesday, President Trump called a press conference and urged Americans to stay calm. Trump handed responsibility for the outbreak over to Vice President Mike Pence and claimed that the South Carolina Democratic debate was largely responsible for the stock crash. Markets continued to fall through Friday as some economists worried aloud about the potential for a global recession. The weekend gave investors a chance to take a deep breath, and after the Federal Reserve signaled they would lower interest rates to boost the economy, the week-long panic gave way to a historic upward correction in stock prices. Today, the Fed followed through on their promise to lower rates 2 weeks before they were expected to do so. This led to another frantic sell-off. More than half of Monday's gains were erased by the time the closing bell rang on Wall Street. Many in the health community have expressed concern about conflicting messages from the Trump administration. At a campaign rally, the president called the coronavirus a hoax, accusing Democrats and media outlets of playing up the virus to hurt his re-election campaign. Trump continues to reassure the public with promises of a vaccine, which experts say is still at least a year away. The situation is not hopeless. In China, the number of reported cases is steadily decreasing, signaling that containment is possible, a message echoed by the World Health Organization. With financial markets swinging wildly and the epidemic worsening, coronavirus should be a priority for governments everywhere. For Money Minute, I'm Zach Miller.
Thanks, Zach. Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney claimed that the tumbling stock market was the fault of the media and its efforts to hurt the president's re-election chances. In the meantime, President Trump has stated the nation is prepared for the virus, and the White House has requested $2.5 billion in emergency funding from Congress. And to talk about this more, we'd like to welcome back in our panel. Now, Dominic, what do you make of President Trump accusing the Democrats of trying to politicize the coronavirus?
I think everyone's politicizing this. I think the Democrats are trying to exploit this to blame President Trump for not responding adequately. He's trying to politicize this to fit his narrative of witch hunt, witch hunt. Both parties will just use whatever news there is out there to attack the other party. So I think his accusation is true, just as Democrats' accusations are true in this matter.
And Emma, what do you make of Trump trying to, at some of his rallies, say, bring politics into it instead of focusing on containment?
I think it's interesting because I'd actually argue that this, as all of health, is a political issue in the sense that people do not have equal access to healthcare in this country and around the world. And until that's the case, then when something of this nature, especially these epidemics and these outbreaks that feel really out of control, are inherently political, who can afford to go to the doctor, who can afford to take time off, etc., it depends a lot on political factors, including socioeconomic status. That being said, I think President Trump is doing something that maybe makes sense for his campaign in that he's trying to protect himself a little bit, but I think also this is this big, scary unknown that governments, even at their best, don't know exactly how to get in front of. And so I think by trying to shift blame, that can take a little bit of the personal responsibility off of the president. That being said, he is our president and it is his job.
And Emma, is it even fair for politicians to be talking about the political implications of coronavirus, or should all the efforts from both the Trump administration and the Democrats be focused on containing and addressing it?
Of course, the priority is getting this under control. And I think, at the end of the day, it's dangerous for everybody when we have an epidemic that's out of control. And so I think on some level, everyone can agree on that. Like I said, there are inherent political factors in the treatment and also the way that it's spread in the first place. And so I think there's a difference between identifying that and discussing that and taking resources away from actually attempting to contain and treat the disease to the best degree we can.
And Dominic, how do you balance sort of the sharing of information with the politicizing of it, especially with all the lawmakers on cable news?
Right. I think you can't really avoid the politicization of this. But I think for the most part, it's pretty useless. Nobody's really benefiting from it. And I think unless you can prove, there was gross negligence by the administration, which doesn't seem to be the case at this point, it's pretty much going to be a non-issue.
Dominic, what sort of bipartisan measures regarding containment, the coronavirus, would you like to see in Washington right now?
So I think this really isn't a congressional issue at all, except for just approving funding. It's mostly an administrative issue. It's the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services responsibility to figure out what the best way of containing the virus is. And President Trump just has to approve whatever their recommendations are. So I don't think there's really much that Congress or either of the parties can do. It's mostly the executive branch that should be taking care of this.
So Emma, Dominic says it's the executive branch that should be taking care of this. Has the Trump administration done enough in trying to contain the virus, or did he start acting too late? Did he minimize the situation altogether?
Well, I think that's what's unfortunate is, and of course, as always, hindsight is 20/20, but we always, it's interesting to think about if we could have gotten in front of this, and obviously viruses do not abide by borders as we think of them, etc. That being said, there has been lots of reports about not super super good access to testing, who's being allowed to be tested, how much testing costs, etc. And I think we've seen in other countries like South Korea a better kind of public health response in terms of being able to have, ubiquitous testing where people can go for free, because that's going to make a difference. If people can't afford to go to the doctor already or take the time off work, then they could have the coronavirus and not even know it. And I think that's where the danger comes in. And a lot of that is policy-based.
Alrighty, thank you so much to our panel. The final word comes right after this break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
For tonight's final word, Politicat contributor Alex Harrison is here to give us a little more insight on the possibility of a brokered convention. Alex?
Thanks, Andrew. As I speak, results are beginning to come in from Super Tuesday states across the nation. And depending on the way delegates break down for frontrunners Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, the Democrats could be looking down the barrel of a brokered convention. Now, to become the nominee outright, a candidate must win over half of all pledged delegates, equaling 1,991. If no candidate wins a majority, then the convention becomes brokered and turns to one of the more infamous groups from the 2016 election, the superdelegates. Superdelegates are party insiders, such as congresspeople and governors, that are allowed to vote for whichever candidate they please. On top of that, all the delegates awarded based on the primary results would also become unbound, so they can vote for whoever they wish to as well. This leaves the Democratic Party between a rock and a hard place. Established party insiders have a clear distaste for outside frontrunner Bernie Sanders, as shown by their consolidation behind former Vice President Joe Biden. But the Vermont senator has a serious chance of winning a plurality, but not majority of delegates by the time the race wraps up. And if that happens, and Biden is nevertheless selected to be the nominee, it would carry a major risk of fracturing the Democratic Party and alienating progressive voters just before a must-win election against Trump. This is entirely uncharted territory. Neither party has ever had a truly brokered convention. No one knows what it would look like or what would happen. Yet the possibility isn't exactly being downplayed. At the Nevada debate on February 19th, every candidate except for Sanders said that the candidate with the plurality of delegates shouldn't necessarily be the nominee. The Democratic Party might have to make an impossible decision, whether to allow an outsider to take over the party or risk disaster in November by selecting someone with less electoral mandate. Make no mistake, viewers, we are right now living in a moment of history. Justin?
Thanks so much, Alex, and that's all the time we have for tonight on Politicat. For everyone here at the show, I'm Justin Sweetwood.
And I'm Andrew Rowan. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great night.